first, of course, you had Church, who was really an impressive person and very unusual in Congress. He was a straight shooter, and that's by itself from Idaho, and he believed in American principles. Okay, that already sets him, in the top 1 or 2 percentile. Then you had, for the only time, a president who was not directly elected, had come from Congress, and when he was told by his own staff, because remember, his chief of staff of Gerald Ford was Dick Cheney, put down this committee. Gerald Ford, no, I can't really do it. It's congressional committee. He had some respect for Congress for the first and last time. And he was unelected, and he didn't really, Watergate had just happened, and he didn't really want to take on a fight between the executive, in which he was weak and unelected, and Congress in the Watergate era. You had a new CIA director, Colby, who actually wanted the shit to come out because he was new and he didn't want to preside over all of this awful stuff. That was very unusual. And J. Edgar Hoover had died a couple of years earlier. And so there was this moment when you could actually investigate something. It was the last time in 49 years. And it did not take till 2001 for the CIA to come back charging. It only took till Reagan. So already by the beginning of the Reagan administration and Bill Casey, the CIA was back in the saddle, as it were. And it does terrible things all over the world. And I've seen some of them, by coincidence, because I don't go, it's not my department, I'm an economist, but I see governments overthrown and I see the hand of the CIA in that, and then I watch how nothing ever happens. Nothing's even looked at, no questions asked. One of the stories that I've told in the last few weeks is that I was trying to help and kibitz with Aristide in Haiti, who I liked and who told me they're going to come get me. And I took it as a metaphor, first of all, and because I'm naive about these things. No, we're going to help you. We're going to get your loan. We're going to do this and that. And sure enough, soon afterwards, the CIA came to get him. And literally, the US ambassador walked Aristide, broad daylight, to an unmarked plane, told him, your life's in jeopardy, get in the plane. And the next thing he knew, I think 23 hours later, he was in Central African Republic, deposed in broad daylight. And for me, what was interesting beyond that story in and of itself was that I called the New York Times reporter for Haiti, and I said to her, cover this, report on this. And she told me, Jeff, my editor's not interested. A coup in broad daylight in the Western Hemisphere, and the New York Times basically never discussed it. Never was interested, couldn't be bothered. Maybe there was a story that he escaped for his life, but talk about it, investigate it, raise questions about it, hell no. And so that, you don't get more clarity than that, in my view. So these are things that for me are quite striking, that it's broad daylight. It's not even subtle. By the way, the Kennedy assassination was broad daylight, and I was 9 years old, so I didn't understand a lot at the time. But after a lifetime, it was a coup in broad daylight. Not even subtle, by the way. It's not as if the doubts of the Warren Commission are somehow highly sophisticated. People were pointing at where the shots came from. Zapruder film showed where the shots came from, the count of the bullets, everything. Said this was a shambolic cover-up, broad daylight. So this is interesting. It's not what we think. It's not even subtle. And that's why you can have a call of Victoria Nuland and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, opining several weeks before Yanukovych's overthrow of who the next government is going to be. And it turns out to be that one, of course, Yatsenyuk. And it's intercepted and posted, and it raises no question for the New York Times. Nobody asks a question. I always mention the New York Times because that was the newspaper that I read all my life and kind of looked to find out something. Now I can't even stand to scan it online, even the page. It's so uninteresting and so puerile. But it's not subtle. And it raises another point, which is if you don't believe in conspiracies, you don't get anything. Of course, these are conspiracies. Conspiracies mean when a group of people do something secretly, illegally. Well, that's another name for that is U.S. foreign policy. It's not even subtle. It's regime change operations, it's coups, it's all kinds of CIA operations. It's secret wars and so on. Those are all conspiracies. You don't have to be some crazy person. In fact, if you don't believe it, you're just not paying attention.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that that's one of the main ways they stop people having a systematic analysis of these agencies, this secret parapolitics that has so much influence is people don't want to be called a conspiracy theorist, and that's what you get called. So it's a very clever way to make people shut up effectively. What you're describing is an out-of-control empire, essentially. One that is launching covert wars all over the world, hot wars, proxy wars, using intelligence agencies to overthrow governments and really sow chaos around the world. And in that context, the major geopolitical shift we've seen in recent decades has been the rise of China as a competitor to the United States. And in my opinion, China, although also concerned with domination like every superpower, has a different way of doing things. For example, if it goes to Africa and wants to work with the government and that government doesn't want to work with them, they won't then overthrow that government. They'll just move on to the next one and try and do a deal with the next one. It seems to be a more pacific approach thus far. So do you agree with me that there's a different complexion to Chinese foreign policy? And do you then hold out some hope for the future in the rise of China and that they may build a world less riven by war and less riven by chaos that we're seeing emanating from Washington and its allies?
Yeah, the way that I've recently summarized this in my own mind is that there's the term hegemon. And I always used to use the term hegemon to mean a country that would aspire to global dominance. And in the 19th century, that was clearly Britain. And in the second half of the 20th century, the United States that aspired to that. John Mearsheimer uses the term hegemon as a dominant regional power. So no doubt the US is hegemonic in the Western Hemisphere. And I believe China is hegemonic in that sense in East Asia. And I believe Russia is hegemonic in the region of the former Soviet Union. And I believe that India is hegemonic by that standard in South Asia. And I count those as the four hegemonic powers in our world today. They're quite different from, say, Germany or France or Britain. All four that I mentioned, China, US, Russia, India, are very large economies, large populations, the US being, well, Russia with 150 million approximately, and China, and US 335 million, and India and China with 1.4 billion. They're all nuclear powers, but lots of nuclear weapons and building their nuclear capacities also. So my feeling is that it's not just China's rise, it's also what we're seeing in Ukraine. The US cannot defeat Russia. It can't. It thought it could. It thought it could bring Russia to its knees. It thought it could provoke regime change. It thought it could crush Russia, embarrass Russia, bluff Russia, but it could not. Putin said, no, I'm not going with you, and I'm not even accepting NATO on my border. So we'll go to war if that's the point. And the US is, in literally these days, is seeing the result of that. Now, my view is, okay, no tragedy. The whole idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine was about as stupid as could be. It didn't make me safer, didn't make Ukraine safer. It only made me less safe and Russia less safe because it brought us closer to nuclear war. And so the whole idea was completely absurd and obscene because we just spent 600,000 Ukrainian lives over this absolutely stupid, useless idea. But the point I would make is that the US can't defeat India. The US can't defeat China. Just one missile getting through is enough to really fuck you over. So the US cannot have wars with these countries. It can't defeat them. It can play games in their neighborhood. It can do all sorts of things. It can try to overthrow them. It actually can't defeat them. That's a great starting point for peace, if we just recognize that. And my point about all of this is stay out of each other's neighborhood. Don't provoke, because the only risk the United States faces as a country at a fundamental level is a nuclear war. Otherwise, no one could touch us. Okay? Yes, our subways don't work, our escalators don't work, my street is lined with garbage, and there are homeless people all over New York. We're screwing ourselves. But for another country, they cannot threaten me at all, except a nuclear war. So my advice is, please don't try to push NATO to Ukraine, because I don't want to die in a nuclear war. And please don't, provoke Pakistan to attack India, or let's not have a nuclear war over Taiwan, which we already said 52 years ago is part of China, and so on. Just stay a little away from each other, and we could actually get on with things just fine, because China cannot threaten the United States, India cannot threaten the United States, Russia cannot threaten the United States, except nuclear annihilation of everybody. That's the only threat. Okay, so in this sense, China's rise is, yes, it definitely adds a peer competitor, to use their language. I don't even view it as a competitor. I like China. I don't think China's in any way, even aside from the military side, I don't view China in any way threatening. I view it as a great civilization that is 10 times older than the United States, and I like the food, I like the sightseeing, I like the people, I like my Chinese students, I like my Chinese colleagues, and I see absolutely no reason for conflict. Yes, we can compete. They did 5G better than us. They're going to produce electric vehicles better than us. But there's no other reason for any darker talk, much less this talk about, a fight to the finish. And whatever China's political system is, by the way, we're going to have our own political system. It's not going to be America's political system. And it happens that China's political system has been China's political system since 221 BC. It's not exactly about the Communist Party of China. It's about China as an administrative state that goes back to the Qin dynasty in 221 BC. So all of that means that China's rise makes more dramatic what was already true, which was the whole idea of US hegemony was just hubris, obnoxious, unnecessary, and not in America's interest already back in 1991, when it was first dreamt up in the end of the Soviet period. Now, I would say it's completely delusional to think that the US runs the world or could run the world or has full spectrum dominance or can prevent China's hegemony in Asia and so on. So then comes another question. Well, what about China's role in Asia? Is it something we should fear? Is it, the spread of some great evil? And there, I think history teaches a lot. And what history shows is that China has been the dominant country of Asia for 800 of the last 1,000 years, with the only exception being basically from the early 1800s till now. And really, I would say from 1839 till around 2010, it was the eclipse by the Western powers from the start of the First Opium War until around 2010. But all the rest of the period, China's been a hegemon. And then you can observe, how did China use its hegemony? It never attacked its neighbors, actually. Amazingly, China went to war with Vietnam 2 times in the last 1,000 years. In 1420 AD, for a few years, and then it retreated because it did not succeed in conquering this tropical country to its south. That was 600 years ago. And for 1 month in 1979, after Vietnam had overthrown China's ally in Cambodia next door, and China went to war for 1 month against Vietnam. How many times did China invade Japan in the last 1,000 years? Well, as China, 0, never. When China was ruled by the Mongols 2 times, 1274 and 1281 AD. So 800 years ago, basically, or 750 years ago. On 2 occasions, the Mongols sent a fleet. Both times they were defeated by typhoons, apparently, the kamikaze wind, so-called. And that was the end of that. How many times did China invade Korea in the last 1,000 years? That would be 0. 0. So if we, and then to understand that, even John Mearsheimer, or maybe I shouldn't say even, he's a good friend. I don't agree with him on a number of things, though I think he's a great political scientist. He says, even as hegemon, and he wants to take on China much more than I do, he says China will not go on wars of conquest in Asia because it's big enough, thank you. And that's the history of 1,000 years, which is, no, thank you. We don't need wars. We're not interested. So all of this means that on a global level and on a regional level, I don't see the argument at all for a China threat, for doing anything other than having a cooperative, diplomatic approach with China. That's my take.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But the propaganda in recent years against China has been huge, posing it as a threat to us and a threat to the global system. I wanted to ask now about Donald Trump, because he's often presented in the media as this unique and alien threat to American democracy and America's role in the world. To me, that seems wrong. To me, he's maybe a more honest representation of what America has always been. And he doesn't speak in the nice liberal terms, the Harvard grad terms about America's role in the world and parrot all the propaganda. But he is a representation of what America is and has been. Do you think Donald Trump is a unique threat to American democracy? And do you think his foreign policy is a unique threat to the world? Or is he merely a continuation of the same policies as we saw under Biden and we saw under Obama, just more honestly presented? And in fact, the priorities of the same interests are being promoted, which is the permanent government, the parts of the state which don't change regardless of who's in the White House.
If you look at foreign policy, I don't like Donald Trump's foreign policy, but I'll say the following. He didn't launch any new wars, so he was the president that made no new wars, the only one from Clinton onward. Clinton had Serbia, Bush, Afghanistan, and Iraq, Obama, Syria, Libya, and Ukraine. Trump, no new wars. Biden doubling down on Ukraine and basically continuing most of the rest. So I give Trump some points for that. I don't give him too many points, by the way, because he really screwed up the negotiations with Iran. He really screwed up the negotiations with North Korea. He really screwed up the negotiations or any chance for peace in the Middle East because he was, as all of them are, completely tied to the hip with Israel. So I don't give him big points. I don't give him any points on climate and many other things. So I don't want to be misunderstood, except on foreign policy, Biden was worse than Trump, I would say. Biden really believed in this stuff. Biden was part of the NATO enlargement in 2014. He was part of the coup in 2014. He definitely played that role. And he prosecuted a war in Ukraine that cost hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian dead, completely avoidable. And he has been complicit in genocide in Gaza. I don't know if Trump would have done anything different on Gaza, probably not. On Ukraine, I think probably, yes, probably would have done different and claims that he's going to do different. And I kind of hope that that's the case. The truth, though, is that we don't know because presidents don't have all that much say. And that, I think, is, again, to go back to the point that we started with. And I was quoting it earlier, so I'll quote it to you because I pulled it up. Putin told Le Figaro on 29 May 2017, I'm quoting from a book of James Haslam that is coming out, but this is what Putin said, quote, I have already spoken to 3 US presidents. They come and go, but politics stay the same at all times. Do you know why? Because of the powerful bureaucracy. When a person is elected, they may have some ideas. Then people with briefcases arrive, well-dressed, wearing dark suits, just like mine, except for the red tie, since they wear black or dark blue ones. These people start explaining how things are done, and instantly everything changes. This is what happens with every administration. And it's just completely classic. Putin gets it, of course. He understands the American deep state more clearly than just about anyone because he was part of the Russian deep state. He knows what this is about. He talks to presidents in the morning, and by afternoon, the presidents explain to them, well, it's not exactly like I told you in the morning, because the men in dark suits have come to explain some truths to them. So this is why one shouldn't get too excited about an election period. Where we are is 30 years into an increasingly disastrous, delusional, and risky strategy. And the deep bureaucracy has not changed the strategy. And the question is whether they will before we all get blown up. And that is still to be determined.